We're live, everybody.
We are
Welcome
live.
back. Welcome, everybody. We are here. I'm here today with Julian Fahrer, founder of Bitcoin Laws. We're here to try our first ever live stream, not just to Spaces, as we've been doing for the last 2 weeks, to discuss what's happening in the world of Bitcoin legislation. As far as I'm concerned, nobody has been sort of covering it, especially on the state level, better than what Julian is doing. So it's an honor to be here with him to talk about this. We're going to give you a warning. It's our first time doing this. If there's any technical difficulties, we're asking for mercy and grace. So please keep that in mind. Also, obviously, I've started having some software issues with my computer. So if I freeze, Julian, I don't mean to I hope not to create like a Wayne's World moment where Wayne leaves the studio and Garth is left alone or something. And it's like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and we're also, I guess, dating ourselves by talking about Wayne's World here. So I apologize
seriously,
to the younger
35-year-old
to the younger viewers. But anyway, let's dive in straight from what just happened. We had Senator Lummis just put out a draft of a bill around de minimis capital gains tax exemptions around digital asset spending, $300 per transaction. So you could spend some Bitcoin, buy your cup of coffee in Bitcoin, and then not have to file your capital gains around that purchase. You could do that to up to $5,000 a year. This will be adjusted for inflation, I think, through starting in 2026. This is just some bullet points from the bill. I guess, Julian, I want to ask your thoughts. Is this enough? I know a lot of people are saying it isn't. I'm one of them. What do you think?
Well, so a couple of things, Frank. Firstly, I didn't get a chance in the intro, and we'll get smoother in this as we go.
Yeah.
But it being July 3, tomorrow being July 4, I thought I just had to bring something a little bit extra for the stream.
Woo!
So I have my
America,
my stars, bars, Bitcoin cap here.
Love it.
So I had to don that. Also, the viewers can see this right now. I don't know if you can see this right now, but on the stream output, I've actually got a little display live in between our heads that has kind of got some of the stuff we're up there talking to. So we'll have visual cues and visual aids, including, as you just mentioned, the just announced new bill from Senator Lummis to do several things, and I haven't had a chance to really read it yet. I think you may have had a chance to skim it, but what we have gleaned from it is, as you said, this de minimis tax exemption for transactions under $300, not just for Bitcoin, but I think for digital assets more broadly, including stable coins. So the context here is, I suppose, the one big beautiful bill, which passed. This is the kind of the not just the Trump bill, but I guess the Trump administration's proposed spending bill, which has then kind of gone through Congress.
Correct.
For everything related to the budget of the federal government, not including anything really related to Bitcoin directly, but there was the potential there. A couple of days ago, this was kind of a discussion that came up. The rumors going around, some potential that there would have been to include an amendment for something like what Senator Lummis has announced in this bill now, which is tax exemption on transactions up to a certain size. So that's what we have here. My guess is, I don't know if she had this in her back pocket already. I mean, people don't draft a bill in 48 hours, right? So I think this would have been in the back pocket, probably ready to go in case the OBBB amendment didn't make it, which it did not. And so now we have this. I guess before we can kind of read through some of the details together, but you perhaps have had a chance to have a little bit of a look at it. Anything other than this headline here that's worth pointing out off the bat?
It's a good question. So I will provide some context, though. No, I haven't read it in that much detail. The biggest thing I was looking at was to see if there was anything that sort of got through in terms of the pushback. A lot of people said we should denominate the de minimis exemption in sats, which is not possible to do because you'd have to denominate it therefore and then in every other digital asset, which, because it's, so you have to sort of stick with a dollar amount, I guess, as far as U.S. legislation when it comes to this. But I did speak with our office 2 days ago when the amendment did not get added to the One Big Beautiful Bill or the One Big Beautiful Act. And She did say that she was not going to give up on a de minimis exemption, that she's still working on it. I would imagine that this might have actually been drafted relatively quickly. But the other thing to keep in mind, in 2023, her and Senator Gillibrand had proposed, I can't remember the name of the bill right now, but they proposed a bill with the first ever proposal for de minimis tax exemptions included in it. So she has some experience with this. I'm not sure if some of that language was lifted from that bill. That bill never went anywhere. I'm not even sure if it was voted. I'm not sure how it worked, but so I think she's sort of familiar with this. I would imagine there might have been a little bit of a copy paste job with some of the other work that she had done on similar legislation. That would be my guess, but I don't know. Have you had any chance to look at it? Is there anything else that stuck out to you maybe?
So I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I do have here, this is Senator Lummis's office's website that has, I think they've summarized it, right? So they've got this overview here. So we just looking at the headlines, obviously, yes, the de minimis gain from sale or exchange of digital assets. So that would be this $300 threshold with a $5,000 cap. I can see that now. So so you can't just do $300 transaction every second of every day infinitely until you've sold your whole stack of Bitcoin cap gains free. So there's something here about the loss from wash sale as well, which could be interesting. So I don't know if you have any more context on that, but I know that
if you sell your let's say you let's say you panic sell your Bitcoin, you bought at 100,000, you saw Samson Mao posting about a God candle, and then all of a sudden it drops to 70,000. You get scared, you sell it. The wash sale essentially, I think under current legislation, if you were to buy that Bitcoin back within a certain time period, I'm assuming it's 30 days based on what I'm seeing in the summary of the bill here, you wouldn't be able to have I think that sale of the Bitcoin be a write-off against some of the gains that you maybe made if you did buy and sell some Bitcoin otherwise. So this would take that away. If you did panic sell, then a few days later, if it went back from 70 to 75 and you decided to buy back in, you could write off that loss that you initially incurred. And then, if you do sell any Bitcoin, you could your gains would be minimized against that loss. So that's my understanding of it. Do have to dive in a little bit deeper. Again, I think this came out literally like 30 minutes ago, so it's not relatively new.
We will see. And okay, so that looks like there are kind of three other main sections here that at least the overview has. First one being something called a mark-to-market election. So it creates a new section of the probably the IRS Act or whatever it's called, allowing dealers and traders in digital assets to elect mark-to-market treatment. So the explanation here is it provides digital asset dealers and traders with the same tax treatment available to their securities and commodity counterparts, eliminating arbitrary discrimination based on asset type. So more accurate income recognition that matches the economic reality of trading businesses. So
I think without getting too, I think we're going to have to see what happens here. I have very little, I won't say very little faith. I don't think this is going to be a standalone bill that ends up getting worked out and, voted on. So I'm imagining this ends up getting included in some other omnibus bill. So my thoughts here is that it's a start. I think there is something to be said about the United States government acknowledging Bitcoin/digital assets as a medium of exchange. The only thing that I'm a little nervous about here is that because this includes stable coins. So let's say Amazon changes from dollars on their website to their own version of a stable coin. And let's say you make $5,000 in purchases on Amazon's site. Now you've spent your $5,000 in stable coins and you have none left for your Bitcoin coffee buys. I don't think this is going, I don't know if it's going to play out that way. I'm imagining there'll be backlash if it does, because I do think Senator Lummis does care about people being able to spend some of their Bitcoin if they want to. But there's a lot of details here that I don't think have been ironed out. I honestly don't even know how she does it, to be honest. Between this and chairing the Senate Banking Subcommittee on digital assets, it just seems like she's constantly trying to do something to appeal to the Bitcoin crowd, and I give her credit for that. But at the same time, it just feels like she has other things to work on as well, and she's just trying to do something.
Yeah, she definitely walks the tightrope pretty well. It's interesting, and this is maybe a little bit more speculative, and I'm not gonna read too much into it. but I will say this just on the relationship to maybe the OBBB provision that didn't make it, and now this. So I got an email this morning from a crypto company that will remain nameless,
Nice.
but they put out a newsletter and they discussed this OBBB amendment that didn't make it, right? And they kind of went to pains to describe what was lacking from that amendment. Specifically, I think that was not inclusive of stablecoins and other things. So that amendment, at least on the reading of this communique that I got from this crypto company, was that was a more Bitcoin focused provision.
Okay.
And so, maybe, I don't have the political context. Maybe this is something you can learn from some of the folks in your orbit. But I wonder if maybe there was opposition to that amendment, even from within the industry, if that was the case and it wasn't inclusive enough.
I will say this, it would not surprise me, because what most people don't know, and I'm glad you're bringing this up, is that there's a lot of that goes on behind closed door, or like that goes on without necessarily being publicized, about kind of what the industry wants to happen. And then there's the sort of Bitcoin only crowd and what sorts of things are sort of being tailored to them. So yeah, that very easily could have been the case. I will be at the next Senate Banking Subcommittee on Digital Assets hearing on Wednesday. There will be some people from the industry there, and I will actually ask this question just to try to get a little bit more background on it. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. I think that's probably the takeaway there, right? Is there's not one homogenous movement here. There are factions. Like any movement, there are factions within it that have different points of view.
And for those who don't get this, we did touch on this in the last two spaces we did. It's like, what happens, so with something like the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, there was sort of provisions in there that would be beneficial for people doing DeFi, but also for people using Bitcoin wallets or building any sort of non-custodial software. So it's, you sort of, there's like you kind of have to look at the Venn diagram with all of the regulation that comes out and see whose sort of missions are aligned in the crypto space. It's like, and you don't really want to be too antagonistic if your missions aren't aligned, because you sort of have to have these relationships, whether you're a hardcore Bitcoin maximalist or like a crypto degen, whatever it is. There's so much going on where you sort of, it seems like it's better to be in one another's corner. Problem there is, like, I was explaining Bitcoin regulation to some of my family members, extended family members yesterday, people that don't pay much attention to this. And they're like, well, why is it always bundled with crypto stuff? And it's just like, yeah, to the average person, I think this all gets very, very confusing. It's just, but on a certain level, like, alliances just sort of need to be there. And where it's valuable for people to support one another, it's very valuable. Like, these things are really, really important. So I think erring on that side of things is sort of the safer bet when it comes to getting the regulation we want to see passed as Bitcoiners.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we move on to we've got a few other stories to touch on. This is one that I don't know if you've seen. Troy Cross and the Nakamoto Project just put out this polling data about Bitcoin. Well, it's called Understanding Bitcoin Adoption in the United States. Bunch of polling data about all things related to politics, demographics, and sentiment. Really interesting to see how this is changing over time as well. And maybe we'll get into, we'll just kind of scroll through Troy's X thread to maybe pull out some of the highlights here. Before I just jump in, anything high level to mention about this?
Yeah, I think there was something about demographics, which is always fascinating to me. I think there was a large amount of Hispanic, Black, and Asian Bitcoin owners. It's not just, it tends to be associated with like a white bros thing when this is not necessarily the case. And a little anecdotal thing there. I covered 3 of the days of the Stand With Crypto tour, which was the kind of Coinbase sponsored, Coinbase sponsored it, but it was its own entity, but it was sort of an entity that was bringing awareness to the crypto voter, and it was giving scores to different politicians, and this was leading up to the last election in November. And when I went out to those events, I went up to one in Nevada, one in Arizona, and one in Pennsylvania. They were super diverse, and I think that this data that Troy found reflects that. I would say the only thing that wasn't similar to what I saw in person was there were more women at the events I went to, more than at least is reflected in the data that Troy shared.
Yeah. Yeah, the demographics part is really interesting. It's it's easy to say this, and I think folks who've been around for a while intuit this and know that the kind of internet spaces that Bitcoiners turn up in a lot or most are not really representative all the time.
Totally.
But it's hard to see that manifest until you actually get some hard data, right?
Yep.
So like this, his I guess I suppose a headline figure that nearly 19% of respondents claim to own Bitcoin in some way or other. So I guess inclusive of ETFs and retirement accounts and other things. I'm kind of surprised by that. It's like 1 in 5 people own Bitcoin at this point in the United States. That's kind of a surprise to me.
Which is kind of nuts because to contextualize that, I think it's just about comparable or potentially less that own stocks. So we're getting to a point now where maybe in the coming years, more people will actually own Bitcoin than own stocks in the United States, which is pretty. And I don't know if indirectly owning stocks, like let's say they indirectly own them because they have a pension with the state or something like that. Like, maybe that's not included in that data, but we are getting to sort of, at least as far as the Bitcoin/crypto voter is concerned, a critical point where it's like there's no good reason to be anti this technology at this point. So and the data continues to show that. I think Troy was also in the comments. I was looking through those comments last night. I think he was quite forward and like, I hope our data was good. I'm not throwing any shade at Troy's data. He's a seasoned academic. He's a great guy. But I like the fact that he's sort of like, well, maybe we did get something wrong, but my guess is that they were probably in the ballpark with what they reported on. Which is cool.
For sure. So yeah, a couple of other things as we skim through, maybe less surprising. Bitcoin owners are younger and more male than the general population. That's not a huge surprise. This one was a little bit more surprising to me. It said Bitcoin owners were significantly more likely to be non-white. Again, just not something that you'd probably pick up from conferences and other spaces, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton in here. It's a really great, interesting report. Recommend anybody to, I guess, check out Troy's X account's probably the first place to go. Nakamoto Project is the name of the organization that's done this polling. Really interesting.
And a quick shill. I just did an interview with Troy at the Bitcoin Policy Summit talking about this data. So that will be out early next week. So keep an eye out for that as well. Yep.
Nice. Okay, so next up, let's actually get the headline. So here's a story, I think from today, potentially too, today or yesterday, that the IMF has rejected a Pakistan plan to, I guess, allocate a bunch of electricity to Bitcoin mining. So this isn't it's not a Bitcoin mining ban, but it is some, I guess, pushback over a plan from the IMF. So this is not the Pakistani government. This is the IMF.
Correct.
So this is the headline from Bitcoin Archive. We can see Daniel Batten has linked his article underneath in Bitcoin Magazine, which maybe we can dive into. But before we jump right in, again, any high level context as to maybe what's going on here with the IMF?
It actually, I think the headline is slightly more ominous than what's happening on the ground. I think some of it was my guess, and I have to dive into this a little bit deeper. I actually just reached out to a contact in the Pakistani government to try to get a quote from him on this, to get some more information on it, because I think because there was also something to do with subsidies here. So I'm assuming this had to do with maybe Pakistan using some of the money they've gotten from the IMF, and I have to do a little bit, to subsidize some of this, but I have to double check on that. I'm not positive. Otherwise, I don't know why they would have to check with the IMF. That's my understanding. It doesn't seem like, unless there was sort of...
Well, there might be a clue here in Daniel's reply related to the state of Pakistani IMF loans that are currently outstanding. Obviously, like anybody who is a debtor, there's leverage involved from the creditor organization, and so the IMF. Well, this is Daniel's article on Bitcoin Magazine, which I would recommend everybody go and read, and it explains in great detail. The title is "How the IMF Prevents Global Bitcoin Adoption," but of course the bigger story, which folks like Alex Gladstein have been expounding on for years, is the influence, the international influence over nation states in general that the IMF is able to impose. Recommend. I don't know, we can either link that somewhere, or folks can probably find that if they do a quick search. Great article. Go and check that out.
Yeah, there's a bunch of reporting on that. I'm trying to get, like I said, I'm trying to get a little bit more background. But again, not defending the IMF at all, but it's similar to the El Salvador situation that just happened, where the IMF lent them 1.5 billion and then said something along the lines of like, not only do we not want you buying Bitcoin with this, which they have seemed to have ignored. I don't know how exactly that's working, but we don't want you mining with it either. It's kind of like someone gives you a loan and says like, okay, it's just the conditions of a loan. Do I like the conditions of the loan? Of course, I don't, as a Bitcoin enthusiast and someone who wants Bitcoin to spread around the world. This is obviously, we know this is what the IMF wants. They're going to use their leverage to keep people addicted or, attached to the fiat system for as long as possible. Pakistan, I think, probably drew some attention. We had at Bitcoin 2025, we had someone from the Pakistan Central Bank who was talking about Pakistan establishing their own strategic Bitcoin reserve. If he's on a big stage talking about that, I'm assuming someone might have tuned in or gotten wind of this and said, okay, well, let's tamper that a little bit. Not going to get into my personal thoughts on the IMF. Definitely not my favorite institution in the world, but this is the way things work. And Daniel's article, I think I'm about halfway through it right now. It's a long one. It is good and worth reading.
Yeah, that's kind of it's a great plug for the Bitcoin conference, right? It's you get up on stage, you say something controversial, and you really do kick the hornet's nest.
Correct.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. So let's move on to a state level story from this week as well. Yep. Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs vetoed the third Bitcoin bill that she has vetoed in the state of Arizona this session, House Bill 2324, which would have created another digital assets reserve. So they already have one, which we'll talk about in a second. This would have created another fund for digital assets obtained through criminal asset forfeiture. What's sometimes referred as criminal or sometimes civil. There's overlap there, but the idea is criminal proceedings happen. This happens all the time, every state and federally. Law enforcement agencies take assets that are, obtained illegally in the process of a crime, right? Money laundering or drug transactions or anything. And so what happens then, this is a whole rabbit hole, which we chatted about a little bit when this news came out, is so there's this question of like, where do those assets go, right? What happens to them? And so I'm not an expert on this, but from the little I've looked into online, there's a whole kind of elaborate system here. Like some portion of it goes to victims of crime. Some portion of it goes, you can try and send it back to, if it was stolen, you can kind of send it back to the owners, obviously. But then, of course, there's going to be remainder, right? There's going to be a windfall often. And so what happens then? Well, it goes to the government and it gets apportioned through either local law enforcement agencies or federal agencies, anybody that was kind of, agencies that were maybe partnering through whatever proceedings there were. And so the idea is, this is what this bill in Arizona would have done, is take, a bunch of Bitcoin and other digital assets that were obtained in this way and stick them in a fund. Yep.
What blew my mind was that we were messaging each other in a thread under your post about this, I think, or maybe my tongue-in-cheek response to this about this Governor Katie Hobbs, who's known to be sort of someone who's quite against Bitcoin and digital assets. It seemed like an easy win. Like, why wouldn't you want to obtain these things through just civil forfeiture? You have these assets, hold on to them, whatever. Even if you don't like them, it's not like you're spending any taxpayer money to get them. But one of the things you were describing, this was fascinating to me, is that there needs to sort of be an arrangement between like who gets what in terms of the authorities that sort of carry out like the law enforcement that carries out the acquiring of these assets through the forfeiture, and then who gets what percentage. That was actually fascinating to me. Do you have experience with this? Or
I don't have experience with it. I just looked it up at some point recently. I saw a post about it and dug a little bit deeper. And yeah, at the federal level, it's interesting. At the federal level, there's actually this thing called the Equitable Sharing Program, which I think is either a DOJ or a US Marshals run program. And this is the idea, right? So they try to be transparent about it. They say, hey, like US Marshals is going to take in billions of dollars worth of confiscated property every year. So in an effort to kind of create some transparency about it, they publish how much they take in and then where it goes and where it gets dispersed to. And so there are these programs like this thing called the Equitable Sharing Program, where they say, all right, we're going to send some of it to partner agencies, we're going to send some of it everywhere. All of it is to say, if we dig a little bit deeper into, so this is the letter, by the way, from Katie Hobbs. After vetoing this bill, this is like a standard practice for governors. They veto a bill, they publish a letter and say, hey, this is why I did it. And so there's not a lot here, but I thought quite interestingly, you can see, she said, today I vetoed this bill. It disincentivizes local law enforcement from working with the state on digital asset forfeiture by removing seized assets from those jurisdictions. So you have to, I think you can read between the lines a little bit there, right? And what seems to be going on is that, as we were just talking about, there is this system by which local law enforcement agencies would get to keep a bunch of these assets. And so if you were going to create a reserve, a Bitcoin reserve or anything else, you might say, well, that sounds wonderful for the state of Arizona. Right. Sure, it does. But maybe it doesn't sound so wonderful for the, the police agencies or whoever else was going to have, or probably has been used to having this type of windfall, and then they wouldn't anymore. So, there are always, as we talked about earlier, different contexts. There are factions and stakeholder groups whose interests aren't always aligned. And it seems in this instance, that has something to do with why this bill got vetoed in Arizona. Yeah.
No, I hope whatever it is, my thoughts were like, well, why not just sort of amend the bill so that everybody gets what they want? But, again, I'm not sure you have a little bit more insight on this than I do. And also, I'm just not sure how that process would even work. But and not even that, like, I'm a big fan of the state, taking assets that get forfeited. I was just thinking more along the lines of, like, I just don't see what the governor sees as a downside here. But given what you just stated and given the way things work, I kind of, it's probably just sort of, this is how things are and the way it was, put together in the bill.
A quick perplexity search tells me, so obviously, to be verified, but apparently local law enforcement agencies keep 100% of the proceeds through whatever they seize in Arizona. Okay. So there you go.
There we figured it out.
That's it. Okay, so that's that. I guess next we had another less than thrilling from a Bitcoiner perspective story during the week at the state level, which was the Connecticut governor, Ned Lamont, has signed into law a bill that bans Bitcoin reserves or any digital asset reserve or any digital asset transactions or acceptance or anything at the level of governments, both at the state level and then I think in local, I don't know what they're called in
jurisdictions,
but local jurisdictions too. So this bill passed a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2-3 weeks ago, passed through the legislature, and then this week or just a few days ago was signed into law by the governor. Reactions to this were funny, including, actually, here we go. This is yours, Frank, with your depiction of the prototypical Connecticut dwelling finance bro who has no knowledge or interest in Bitcoin and what it does or what it's even backed by. But this was kind of an unfortunate, strange bill. Obviously unfortunate, it sucks for Connecticut, but a weird one too. This bill isn't called the anti-SBR bill. This bill isn't called the never accept Bitcoin ever forever because we hate it bill. It's actually much more anodyne than that, and it's about like a bunch of procedural things. Not procedural, but it's like different regulatory measures that the state is taking. And then if you it's like on the 3rd or 4th page of this thing, someone somehow has snuck in this provision just banning forever Bitcoin reserves. So it might be, if you're into this kind of thing, it'd be an interesting story to figure out how a seemingly extreme and like an auxiliary provision that's like not super central to the bill itself that has such wide-ranging effect got stuck in there. But in any case, bad news for Connecticut if you're a Bitcoiner.
Totally. And some context there for people who aren't familiar with Connecticut. It is sort of like the the land of where a lot of even the hedge fund people that operate in New York, a lot of them come in from Connecticut. Some of it has to do with tax breaks. If you're living in Connecticut, working in New York, you have certain tax breaks. But this is where Ray Dalio lives. A lot of like in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is not far from, this right above New York, Yonkers. It's, it's not far from there. You can easily commute from New York City to these parts of Connecticut. And with a lot of these types, it's it's intense TradFi bro culture. So it doesn't surprise me that they don't like it. The other side of things is, as someone who used to work in human services, there's a massive gap, income inequality or gap in wealth in Connecticut. So part of me is like, well, it'd be good if the state maybe adopted this as a resource for their pension fund or something along the lines for people who are working. Who are working as teachers or something in Connecticut. It just seems like a prudent thing for Connecticut to do. But yes, as my meme sort of pointed out, like I'm not going to lose any sleep over the bros not having Bitcoin in their state's coffers. Just is what it is. No offense to the bros or anything, but it almost speaks to this idea that like the Warren Buffetts, the people who have everything they need times a quadrillion, not liking Bitcoin, not seeing the value in Bitcoin. This I feel like is like if I were to choose one state in the union to say like it would be borderline comical if they were the ones to reject it, it would be Connecticut, because there's so much privilege and so much sort of like TradFi wealth in the state that there's no real reason for the people with money or maybe those in power to wrap their heads around it because they just don't need to. So this was not surprising, maybe disappointing on some levels, but not surprising at all.
Yeah, totally. It's funny, the last year or so since the ETFs launched, and there's been this institutional and TradFi embrace of Bitcoin. It feels to me a little bit like maybe the narrative has pivoted from like a Bitcoin narrative has maybe changed a little bit, where previously there was this sense that maybe Bitcoin was going to be this transformative technology and system which allowed new class of people to have influence and power over, major institutions. And that maybe the TradFi folks, the more traditional ones who are beneficiaries of the fiat system, would be late to the game. And then that kind of changed a little bit when Larry Fink got on board. And then at least from my perspective, I thought, well, actually, maybe they're not going to be late to the game. Maybe, this is not something that not that I look forward to this, but maybe actually TradFi folks are going to benefit from Bitcoin because they've got a lot of capital and, and that's what moves the needle.
Totally.
But then you see something like this and you say, you know what? No, there actually are going to be holdouts from, it is a bit of a meme, but there are people who really are, close to the money printer, and they are beneficiaries of the status quo. And it makes sense that they will be a little bit late to the party.
Yeah, 100%. Again, not losing any sleep. I had something even kind of meaner or more facetious that I wanted to tweet out. I toned it down with that one, but it is what it is. And Connecticut, they'll come around eventually. They'll, as they say, they'll get Bitcoin at the price they deserve. Not that I like talking like that, but I think that there's a little bit of that vibe there.
For sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so this was the OBBB. I think we probably touched on that.
Yeah, we're good. I think with that
a ton more we need to go through there.
Actually, I'm going to do one comment on that, if you don't mind. Just something to keep in mind. I've been thinking a lot about this. Kind of lost a little bit of sleep over it. It was good that they were going to add a Bitcoin amendment, albeit sort of like a not great amendment. I think it's great. Anything that sort of has the government acknowledging that Bitcoin is a medium of exchange, that's great. And, that's fine on some level. On another level, I think it was Merch from Chain Code Labs, a brilliant developer, longtime Bitcoin developer. He commented on when I wrote something about this and posted it to Nostr. He commented on Nostr saying like, part of my language, but it's like a cherry on top of a pile of dog shit. And you can have your feelings about the bill. I personally don't really love it, from someone who doesn't think it's a good idea to add another $4 trillion to our, national debt when we're already at whatever it is, 36, 37 trillion. Some people might say, what's another couple trillion? What does it matter? Well, one day it's going to matter. We don't know when that bubble or that sort of lack of faith becomes a real critical issue, but it is an issue. And I want to give, I think it's for whatever you feel about it, I think it is important to acknowledge the Thomas Masseys of the world and the people who are saying, like, even what Elon has done, sort of gone a bit unhinged, saying he's going to now support everybody who's been against this bill and blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't say I'm that hardcore about it. But I think it is also important to be discerning. While Bitcoin is sort of the center of a lot of our universes, especially, those of us who work in the space, it doesn't mean like we have to sort of be totally pumped about every sort of like bone that gets thrown our way. We can think critically about these bills and say, hey, it would be great to have this de minimis exemption, but maybe the trade-off here isn't so great. So this is just a little bit of a call to like critical thinking. You're allowed to not like these bills. Please keep that in mind. You don't just have to support them because some sort of Bitcoin amendment is added to them or might be added to them. Think critically about this stuff. Personally, while I want to see broader Bitcoin adoption, I'm not one of these. I'm not a catastrophist. I don't want to see the world fall apart. I don't want to see fiat fall apart and all that. I don't want to live in a Mad Max world, and that's how Bitcoin gets adopted. So, just a little shout out to critical thinking here. Just give yourself some space to look at these things and say, are we getting enough? And maybe that was more like, someone said, well, the de minimis thing should be higher, or they should be giving us more, or I'd vote for it if the bill wasn't as bad. Yeah, all that sort of critical thinking, I think, is something to really not push to the side. Embrace that sort of critical thinking. It's important.
Yeah, well said. I think the only thing I'd add to that is I think it is getting easier and will continue to get easier to apply a certain level of critical thinking and nuance, particularly when it comes to a lot of this legislation and just policy developments and politicians' stances.
Yep.
Right? And what I mean by that is, 2 or 3 years ago, everything was a lot more black and white, at least as far as politicians were concerned, right? It was like, to the extent that it's even being talked about at all, it was maybe people like Elizabeth Warren saying this thing needs to be wiped off the face of the planet.
Totally.
And then you had, early, maybe more trepidatious, just generally positive stuff said about it too. The early advocacy from people like Senator Lummis. And so in that world, where things are less sophisticated, it's like, well, I've got my pro-Bitcoin people and my anti-Bitcoin people. And the choice is really simple. But in a world in which I think we're entering into now, where it's not, we've progressed a lot, and we've progressed beyond that kind of black and white, do or die type of conflict.
Yes.
Now the not only are the positions of people getting more sophisticated, but then the flow-on consequences from that, i.e. the legislation, gets more sophisticated and nuanced as well. And so you'll have, you see this, for example, in the discussion around the market structure bill, right?
Yep.
It's like, it's not just pro or con, it's, well, do we package it with stablecoins? Do we, there's all the different moving pieces of it. And so as a Bitcoiner, we're beyond the point now where you can just say, oh, I'm a Bitcoiner and this is pro Bitcoin, and therefore like tick the box. So
100%.
As you say, it's incumbent on people to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, appreciate that. Great context, great addition. I agree 100%. We're moving into an age of nuance when it comes to the way the government looks at Bitcoin and what we want to accept and not accept in terms of the way we think legislation should look. So yeah, definitely something to think about.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good segue. Speaking of nuance, this is a little bit more of a thornier, complex one that doesn't jump off the page maybe quite in the same way. But Eleanor Terrett at Crypto in America has reported that Ripple and I think some other crypto firms as well have applied for OCC trust charters, which we'll get into this, and there's a little bit of context added from Caitlin Long, who this is very relevant to, which we'll add in a second. But this is basically now crypto firms of many different stripes are applying for either banking licenses outright or quasi banking licenses, which I believe this OCC charter is. So again, we're not going to get into the weeds here of the complexity of all these different overlapping regulatory bodies and what they do, but Caitlin, I'll just flip to Caitlin's post for a second here. She's got the quote. There are basically, the way to think about it is there are different tiers of potential banking licenses and trust charters. So, a Fed master account is diamond, bank is platinum, trust companies are gold, and money transmitter licenses are silver. So all of these things, all of these different licensing regimes allow crypto firms to integrate with and operate with fiat banking rails in different ways and at different levels.
Yep.
And so, yeah, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity here. But then the news, I suppose, is that Ripple and others are now going to attempt to go through the OCC, which may be kind of sidestepping some of the stuff that Custodia has had to go through.
Unsuccessfully, we might note.
Yeah.
For no. Actually, I emailed Caitlin about this week. For no fault of Caitlin's, Caitlin is still in the process of suing the Federal Reserve for not granting her a banking license, and I'm not sure exactly what those grounds are. But I think what's really fascinating with what Caitlin was trying to do, and I think this is something to pay attention to with when we see what other licenses these other crypto firms are going for and what they plan to do in operating their bank or trust company, is Caitlin was actually trying to create, I won't say a first of its kind bank in America, but something quite unique, which was an over-collateralized non-fractional reserve bank, which means she was going to hold $1.08 to every dollar that was held in that bank. And so that was that you always knew, so that you couldn't have what was the bank that collapsed? Silvergate that collapsed in 2023. You couldn't have a run on the bank and then the bank didn't have their money because they were fractionally reserved and they were holding treasuries and there was duration mismatch and all that. So Caitlin was like, no, you're actually going to pay a fee for us to hold your money, and we're actually going to hold your money. We're going to over collateralize it. There was that. And then the other side of her bank was to hold Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And that I think you would pay a fee for as well. So it's kind of insane that something so safe, the Federal Reserve might have their feelings about Bitcoin being safe. That is what it is. But a over-collateralized non-fractional reserve bank, it's almost like they didn't want that standard being set. I'm not going to get too tinfoil hatty, but it is important to note, because we'll see what these other banks, what these other companies are, what the terms of whatever license they get look like. I think it's something worth noting. So it's not that the devil's in the details here, but sort of like, what if Custodia was sort of one of the first to go at trying to get something like this and didn't get it because of the way that they had structured or proposed structuring what they were trying to bring to market. I'll be interested to see what does end up passing, and then also paying attention to the levels of like as you just talked about, the platinum, gold, and silver levels of this, and which institutions get what.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me, I'd have to go back and check, and it's certainly not my area of expertise, but I seem to remember when a lot of the discussion, when some discussion of Custodia was happening, it might have been around the time that Silvergate and whatnot were going on as well.
Yep.
That I think it was Lynn Alden who maybe posted about this and had some analysis on it. But there are some theoretical reasons why one over-collateralized bank in the form that Custodia would be why the Fed might want to exclude it from the system, right? It's not necessarily just being an anti-Bitcoin thing, and again, don't have the details on the top of my head, but it's something like Custodia would then be a magnet for a kind of like inrush of capital from the rest of the banking system, right?
Correct.
Which would then be a potentially theoretically destabilizing force.
Yep. Yeah, I spoke with a friend of mine. I had dinner with a friend of mine who used to work for a hedge fund, and she just started laughing when I told her that. She's like, "Oh, no. The banking industry is not going to allow that, honey." Like, she was just like, "That's cute that she even tried that." Like, that's not how. I was like, "Oh, that's ominous. That's heavy." So, yeah, quite intense. Love Caitlin. I hosted an event for the Bitcoin Bugle. If you're not following the Bugle, please do so. Funny account. I was emceeing an event where her and Trace Mayer were the guests of honor at the end of it, and I got to speak with her a bunch about that. But yeah, it really pointed out the fact that everybody talks their good game about not liking the Fed and everything else. Caitlin Long actually went and sued them. So like, Caitlin is the boss. Love Caitlin. Shout out to Caitlin. Yeah, I love what she's trying. I love what she's trying to do, and also her experience. One, she's a dyed-in-the-wool Bitcoiner, tried and true, but also her experience on Wall Street, 13 years experience on Wall Street. She has 2 graduate level degrees from Harvard, I think a master's in public policy plus a law degree from there. She's just an amazing force to have on Team Bitcoin. And ideally, maybe at some point in the future, if things do end up working out and she gets her license and starts the awesomest bank ever. So, hopefully that works out eventually.
Hopefully, yeah. Well, the winds of change are coming towards the Federal Reserve in more than one way.
This is
including with the forthcoming change at the chair position, which well, there seems to be news back and forth about that every day. Actually, I don't know if maybe you have any off the record insight here into whether or not this interview process is going to get underway.
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a sellout here. I don't, to be honest, I don't. I heard some rumors, but this is just Twitter stuff. I saw something about Bessent potentially being, Trump's person for it, which wouldn't surprise me at all. And I think Bessent's a good dude for the job, pretty mild-mannered, has the right sort of temperament for it, definitely has the knowledge of markets for it. But to be honest, all I wanted to say about it was like I semi feel bad for Powell. Like for as much as I disagree with most of the job Powell did, especially letting inflation get to 10% under Biden, he did his best, what's his name, Paul Volcker impression over these last few years. He really did try to I can't say really. He made somewhat of an effort to break the back of inflation. Yeah. And I sort of feel bad for the guy that now it's just like all that might just go straight out the window if we end up cutting rates into what's already a hot market, S&P index at the highest, Bitcoin at the highest, everything's sort of ripping. Housing is like a little bit subdued, but I have a feeling that'll come back sooner than later once people feel like they're rich on paper again, or whatever, their 401k is higher or their Bitcoin value is higher. So I semi feel bad for the guy. I don't think he's going to win here, but I don't know. And I don't know what this process of I don't know how much pressure really needs to be applied for anything to really change here. But yeah, we'll see. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I have some sympathy for him too. I mean, his job isn't to pump risk assets, right?
Totally. That's
not his job. It would be nice, I guess, on a personal level for me and other Bitcoin if it was, but that's not the case.
Yep.
Yeah, look, I agree with what you said. Took too long to raise rates. But now that he's stuck it out in the face of some serious criticism from Donald J. Trump and others, senior administration members. So I think he's a man of integrity. I'm not sure anybody could really doubt his commitment to fulfilling the mandate of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
We might not like what that mandate and for other reasons, but insofar as he's there to do a job, I think he's doing it.
Agreed. I think that's a fair way to put it, and we probably should move on before we get completely canceled from the Bitcoin space, saying good things about the Fed.
A couple of other things to tick off on state level developments. One is there's a bill in California. It's not an earth-shattering bill, but it is about unclaimed property laws. Which this actually, when this was introduced, or I think passed through the California Assembly, I think it is, a couple of weeks ago, there was a bit of a stir about it on X because I think folks maybe didn't understand what unclaimed property is. there's like a technical definition to it. But the idea here is basically, and we've talked about this before. Let me just get you back up there. So dormant accounts, whether they're dormant personal accounts at banks, at exchanges, dormant property of any kind, if it sits around for years and years, whoever is the kind of temporary custodian of it, like a Coinbase, doesn't get to keep it forever. The state actually steps in and says, no, we need to kind of take that and return it to the rightful owners in some way. That's basically just what unclaimed property is and how it works. And so California is moving a bill through the legislature to update its unclaimed property laws to include digital assets. And so that bill just passed through the Judiciary Committee in the Senate without much fanfare, and so it looks like that's going to probably make it through too. Again, not earth-shattering, but we talked about this last week too. These are the types of little developments that are now just ticking along everywhere and are happening behind the scenes, and no one really is going to pay much attention to them. But if on a macro level, every little one of these represents, to me at least, further integration of Bitcoin into the financial and legal systems. And so it's just nice to see.
No question. Yeah, agreed there. I don't have as much background on that one. We can actually move on. But yeah, appreciate the update on that one.
Cool. And another quick one. A couple of updates in Massachusetts, which has been quiet for a few months. A couple of bills. Again, not earth-shattering, but they've got a bill for creating commissions to study blockchain technologies in different ways. Again, another thing we talked about last week, where it's just part of the slow, grinding process of democracy, where first lawmakers have to learn about this stuff, then they have to make determinations one at a time. But yeah, there's a bill to create a 25-member special commission in Massachusetts, which is going to evaluate lots of different ways that blockchain technologies can be used. I think at the government level, potentially this one is about. Yeah, whether it's going to be accepted as payments and other things too. So
amazing. And a quick shout out too. Speaking of Massachusetts, I met with two of the guys from the Progressive Bitcoiner, Trey and Jason Myers, the author of a progressive's case for Bitcoin, published by Bitcoin Magazine Books. Both great individuals. Jason and Trey are great. Trey, I think, was the founder of the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast. Now it's a 501c3 nonprofit. And I want to give a super shout out because they've made progress that I think a lot of other people have been trying to make. They spoke with someone from Senator Warren's office about Bitcoin. They actually had a conversation with one of her staffers, and the staffer was receptive and was like, wow, this is super cool that you're trying to bring, Bitcoin, into the progressive conversation. So shout out to Trey, shout out to Jason for, rest of us have sort of given up, we just throw stones at Warren. We thought she would never listen. Turns out maybe if you just email her nicely, you can actually get her attention. So it's always good to have examples like that in the space. I also did an interview with Jason about this. It was before he met with Warren's team. But I think what the Progressive Bitcoin, what they're doing is really important. There's obvious, in my case, there's obvious overlap with progressive values, the biggest one probably being financial inclusion. And I think the work that they're doing, especially now as a 501c3 and trying to have more meetings, and Trey, they're both just looking to get far more involved. I know they also Jason brought some members of the DNC to Pubkey, had them pay with Bitcoin at Pubkey to see how it works and stuff. So they're doing the work. Want to shout them out. And so maybe things will change one day in Massachusetts. Who knows?
Yeah, I think if Elizabeth Warren's office and other folks in that world and of that persuasion are going to listen to anybody, it's probably going to be people from the same side of the aisle with similar values, right? It's hard to yell across the aisle and be persuasive at this point.
Yep.
So.
Yep.
Well, I guess we've got maybe a couple of minutes left in the hour. A couple of things left on the agenda. You mentioned Pubkey. I was wondering if you wanted to maybe give a quick shout out to a couple of things that you've been up to recently. There and in your local neck of the woods, some interviews and then maybe an NPR story as well.
Yeah, sure. We'll touch on them real quick. Pubkey, I interviewed a Venezuelan opposition leader. I wouldn't say the Venezuelan opposition leader. I think that title kind of belongs to Maria Machado right now, who's on the ground in Venezuela. She technically won the vote in the previous election that just recently happened. I think she got 73% of the vote, but the government is not acknowledging it. I lived in Venezuela from 2010 to 11 under the Chavez regime. It was the beginning of inflation getting very bad there. It was by no means when things had gone off the rails, which was like 2013, 14-ish. That's when things got really, really bad. But there was already a black market for dollars while I lived there. Things were bad. Even I lived in what's called a barrio. Barrio is like the tin shack, favela, township sort of neighborhood. And it was interesting. And I mentioned this in the interview with Leopoldo. Even the people in that place were like, yeah, Chavez is kind of nuts. But what I saw with Chavez, you would imagine that they wouldn't in those areas. Like those were the poor. They were the ones that were beneficiaries of some of the good work that Chavez did, which often doesn't get mentioned. He did bring a lot of doctors into the country. That did help people. He made college more affordable for the poor. This often gets overlooked because of what Venezuela has turned into, but there was good work done, especially at the beginning of his time there. It was inspiring to speak with Leopoldo. My family, I was with some of my family who lived in Venezuela yesterday. It's a long story, which I'm not going to get into, but I think with what I learned from them is just sort of, there's a few things you always want to watch out for. And it's like, I'm personally sort of, whether you're sort of center right, center left, doesn't make a big difference to me. It's when you get to the really far extremes, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I'm not a socialist. Like that. That's sort of where I am. Like, I'm sort of like a pragmatist. What seems to work. I want Bitcoin to obviously be okay for people to use, but I'm not a burn it all down sort of guy. So, with Leopoldo, I think he was coming at it from a similar place. He ended up working with Enrique Capriles, who ran for president of Venezuela in 2013 and 14. They say he won, with all the distortion. There was ballots being stolen, burned, whatever. I'm sure he did. He didn't actually get elected, though. I'm mixing up the two names. Yeah, Leopoldo Lopez ended up going to jail for years, I think from like 2014 almost through 2020. He ended up sneaking out of the country during COVID. But I think the big lesson to take away from maybe something that's relevant, let's say to like a US audience, there's a lot of critique around Zoran Mamdani, who is the Democratic nominee for president in New York City. People yelling about socialism and how he's evil and this and that. And I do agree, but not just because he's proposing higher taxes on the rich or something. That's sort of like, I could kind of live with that. Like, that's more ideological. I don't fully agree with it. But what he's talking about is proposing like state-run grocery stores, complete freezes on rents. This stuff is worrisome. And I'm not saying this just to be like shitty or whatever, because even AOC and Bernie weren't saying this kind of stuff. He's talking about seizing the means of production and all this. I lived through that in Venezuela. When people are like, well, it can't get any worse, let me just, like, it can get worse. Believe me, it can get a lot worse. I've seen that up close. Majority of my friends from Venezuela are refugees, so it meant a lot to see them, meet with Leopoldo Lopez. And, we're at a point where even my family was very, very to the left. They're not Chavistas. They're not fans of Maduro in Venezuela. They weren't Leopoldo Lopez fans to begin with, but they're just at a point where they're like, anybody that's against the current regime, we're for. So thank you for speaking with him. But I think there's really some lessons to be learned there. And I think that the answer usually lies not at the super fringes. It's not, it's not burn the whole system down and just free market rules everything. And it's definitely not seize the means of productions and freeze rents and stuff like that. I think if we're being intellectually honest, though, the one thing people really need to be mindful of is when prices get distorted too much, that really seems to be when things go haywire. And we know that the Fed has distorted prices, the Treasury has distorted prices, the powers that be have distorted prices also, which, to be honest, is a form of socialism, in my humble opinion. There's bailouts for the rich. Martin Luther King said this best. We have socialism for the rich and rugged capitalism for everybody else. And so I think, with Zoran, I have a little bit of, for those who are actually poor, struggling, hurting, I worked in social services. I get why they would be attracted to someone like this. But there were a lot of college educated people sort of voting with their luxury beliefs. Like, yeah, we have to burn down the capitalist system, this and that. Like, yeah, I have my issues with the capitalist system. It's not perfect. That's great. The big thing, though, is like the real point to a market economy is so a market is essentially the sum intelligence of all of its participants. That's what a price is. All of that information goes into what a price is. Thomas Sowell talks a lot about this. A lot of great people sort of in the libertarian school talk about this. When you really, really mess with that, that tends to be when all hell breaks loose. So I don't think when Leopoldo Lopez said, like, in Venezuela, we had, government-run grocery stores and rent freezes, I don't even think he was being facetious. People in the audience started laughing because they were like, oh, we're getting that proposal here in New York now. And that was probably the one moment where I was like, whoa, this is a little bit sort of crazy. But it was a great experience to be with him. I met a number of other Venezuelan activists at that event, one of which I had dinner with. She spent 7 months in prison in Venezuela. I had dinner with her 2 nights ago. Anyone who's super extreme, you should always be wary of, and the whole it'll never happen here in the United States for whatever reasons. I don't really buy that. And I just think it's good to be wary, but at the same time, you don't have to like post memes. It was like New York on fire with Zoran in front of it, burning it down. Like, you can be more nuanced in your analysis. Like, I've tried to say, like, I've lived through this in Venezuela. We really have to be careful when we start hearing talk like this. And I think that just adds to a little bit better dialogue. Demonizing people, us versus them, doesn't really win in the long term. I'd actually personally like to speak with him just to get an idea of like how serious he is about all this. So we'll see what happens. Not a big fan or whatever, but just to tie the interview with Leopoldo back to that. But that interview lives on Bitcoin Magazine's YouTube channel, so please check it out. It also starts with a documentary about the work that Leopoldo did in Venezuela, which is surely worth watching as well. I don't know if you caught any of it, any thoughts or anything.
No,
yeah.
not yet, but I certainly will. I think all really well said. Not much to add there, except that. I think what strikes me about, let's say, this Mamdani discussion now is, well, there is a segment of opposition to him that is of a kind of accelerationist flavor, where it's like, you know what? Let's let him have it.
Let's go, right?
Let's let New York burn. Let's like go full throttle socialism, everything else, and then the people will realize the error of their ways who supported that stuff. And to me, that's just completely bunk thinking.
Totally.
Like, I couldn't disagree with that more. Like, to me, you win by winning, and
That's
you
right.
don't win by losing first. You don't lose first with a intention to win later, right?
Yep.
If for no other reason than I don't actually think people learn the error of their ways. Like, if that's one thing that you can maybe learn from, you could pluck out from the unbroken strand of, let's say, socialist ideology. It's that it's not like there's admission that these policies don't work.
Right. That's
the
right.
problem is, oh, well, we didn't do them hard enough, right? So, there's not, this is kind of a fantasy that, hey, let's just accelerate, let everything burn down, and then we will be so great by comparison and we'll take power afterwards. No, of course, people get hurt along the way too. That's maybe the most important part. What about everybody else that loses along the way? So I just think it's better to, as you said, attack the ideas insofar as that, even if they're not sincerely held, attack the actual ideas, the actual principles, and win would be my proposal.
That's my guess too, and I have mixed feelings about that. I've written critically about Eric Adams, and to see people rushing to his aid now, saying like he's our only hope. I'm like, oh, please let there be another only hope, because I don't want that to be the case. And I've written critically about him in regard to, he's talked a big game with what he's going to do for Bitcoin and crypto. I met with him at Gracie Mansion, the mayor's mansion.
We may have lost Frank right at the end there, talking about Mayor Adams. So let's see if he returns in the next 30 seconds. But we're already kind of past the hour here, so I'll probably start to wrap it up. Thanks to everybody who's tuning in or has tuned in. This has been a lot of fun. This is our first attempt at a live stream of this kind. I'm sure we'll do it again in future. Thanks to Frank, thanks to the Bitcoin Magazine for helping to stream this and to produce it. Please go and follow Frank at Frank Corva on Twitter. Again, my name is Julian Fahrer. You can follow me at Bitcoin_laws, which is where my project Bitcoin Laws lives, on Twitter, on X. But in the meantime, I think we're probably not, well, Frank says he's coming back. Maybe we'll give him 30 seconds to do so. Nothing else. Oh, here we go. Almost. Sorry, that's me twice. some final technical difficulties at the end here. 1 second. No, I think we're going to call it there. I'll just send him a message. This is the beauty of doing things live. All right, Frank's not coming back. Thanks, everybody. Happy 4th of July tomorrow, and we will see you back again here soon.